In medieval Europe, a woman's worth was tied tightly to her body, her purity, and her ability to bear children. But what happened when that body became a weapon in the eyes of men? We often hear of men being castrated, turned into eunuchs for royal service, punished through the loss of their manhood. But what they rarely teach you is that women, too, were subjected to something just as cruel. It wasn't surgical. It wasn't clean. It was punishment by mutilation, and its purpose? To strip a woman of her femininity, to silence her sexuality, to destroy her ability to reproduce, and to make her an example. These weren't isolated cases. Across dungeons, courtrooms, and execution grounds, especially in times of war, religious paranoia, or male vengeance, some women were subjected to unspeakable brutality, much of it aimed between their legs. When we hear the word castration, we often think of a knife, a man, and the removal of testicles. It's clean in definition, if not in practice, but when it comes to women, the term gets murky, even more brutal, and far more ignored. Female castration in the Middle Ages didn't follow a strict definition because it wasn't a recognized legal punishment. It wasn't written into law books or recorded like male castration. Instead, it existed in the shadows as a set of cruel practices driven by revenge, fear, and domination. So what did it look like? Sometimes it meant the mutilation of the internal organs, the external genitals with sharp objects or irons. A woman accused of adultery, promiscuity, or even seduction could have her parts cut off, her body mutilated, or her genitals burned as a way of removing her sin. In these instances, the aim was clear: to punish the woman by targeting the very part of her body society believed caused temptation and shame. In other cases, tools of torture like red-hot tongs or searing rods were inserted into the vagina as part of public executions or confessions, especially during witch trials. This wasn't just physical pain. It was humiliation, a surgical erasure of womanhood carried out by men who believed they were purifying her soul or defending their honor. The term female castration is also used by some historians to describe forced sterilization or the removal of reproductive function, not through advanced medical surgery, but through blunt trauma and torture. There are recorded incidents of women being beaten in the lower abdomen until they bled internally, or being impaled with objects that destroyed the uterus, all without anesthesia, all done as punishment. These acts were rarely documented in official court records. Why? Because they were not meant to be preserved. They were often carried out in dark dungeons, behind closed monastery doors, or at the whims of a powerful man with no one to answer to. But their impact was devastating. These women were robbed of their ability to have children, stripped of their sexual identity, and branded as ruined both physically and socially. What makes it worse is that many of these women were never criminals in any real sense. Some were punished for being too beautiful, too outspoken, too independent, or for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong man's attention. This was not about justice. It was about control, a desperate, bloody attempt to control the one thing that terrified medieval men the most: a woman who knew her own power. In the Middle Ages, Europe was ruled not just by kings, but by beliefs. Beliefs that women were naturally weaker, morally fragile, and spiritually suspicious. Religious doctrine often painted women as the daughters of Eve, the original sinner, the one who led man astray. So in the eyes of the church and the law, a woman's body was not hers. It belonged to her father, her husband, or her God, and any woman who dared to break free of that control was seen not as brave, but as dangerous. Purity was everything. A woman's virginity before marriage was guarded like treasure. Her faithfulness in marriage was demanded without question, and her obedience to her husband, the priest, and society was enforced with an iron fist. When a man stepped out of line, he might be whipped, fined, or imprisoned. But when a woman defied expectations by cheating, rebelling, speaking too freely, or even being raped, she was often the one who got blamed and punished. In some places, Adulterous women were paraded through the streets naked, their hair shaved off, their faces smeared with ash or excrement. In others, they were burned with hot irons or forced to wear humiliating devices like the scold's bridle, a metal mask with a tongue clamp. But some punishments went even further. When the goal was not just shame but destruction, her femininity itself became the target. Why? Because in a society obsessed with control, nothing was more threatening than a woman who owned her body. So female genital mutilation, though rarely written about, became a dark undercurrent in the enforcement of gender roles. Whether by vengeful husbands, religious inquisitors, or sadistic torturers, some women were mutilated in ways meant to erase their sexuality, fertility, and dignity all at once. And the worst part? It was often done not in secret, but in public, as a warning. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place. This wasn't just punishment. It was psychological warfare waged against half the population, using their bodies as battlegrounds. And as we dig deeper into the brutal specifics, one thing becomes clear. They didn't just want to hurt these women, they wanted to make them unwomen. If the Middle Ages had a face of terror for women, it was the witch trial, a toxic mix of religion, superstition, and raw misogyny, where being a woman was dangerous and being different was deadly. Between the 15th and 17th centuries, thousands of women were accused of witchcraft across Europe, and what began as whispers in the village often ended in fire, rope, or iron. But before the execution came the interrogation, and in many cases, that meant torture. Church inquisitors, often men cloaked in holy robes, believed the female body was a vessel for evil, that Satan himself had left marks on a witch's flesh invisible to the naked eye, but discoverable through painful searches. And so began one of the most grotesque rituals of control in medieval Europe. Women were stripped naked in cold stone chambers. Their bodies were examined, poked, and prodded by male clerics looking for witches' marks, moles, scars, even birthmarks. But the search didn't stop at the surface. In some cases, the torture became deeply invasive. They used sharp objects, red-hot rods, or iron instruments, not just to extract confessions, but to punish the devil inside them. Some had spikes forced into their vaginas. Others were burned internally with searing irons. This wasn't just torture, it was symbolic mutilation. They believed the female sex was the gateway to sin, so they sought to destroy it. Worse still, these acts were often justified as acts of purification. Clergymen believed they were saving souls by destroying flesh, a twisted logic that turned rape and mutilation into holy work. Imagine being accused with no proof, tortured without trial, and punished without mercy, all because you were widowed, beautiful, outspoken, or simply unlucky. No one was safe. A herbalist, a midwife, a woman with too many cats, all could be labeled witches. And once the accusation stuck, your fate was sealed. Even teenage girls weren't spared. There are horrific accounts of young girls subjected to torture under the excuse of devil inspection. Some bled to death before even reaching trial. Others survived only to be burned alive. The irony? These trials were never about witches. They were about control, silencing women who didn't conform, didn't obey, or simply existed in a society obsessed with purity and submission. Witch hunts gave society permission to torture women publicly and called it justice. They took female bodies and turned them into battlegrounds, and in many cases, castration-like mutilation was the weapon. But not all horror came from religion. Sometimes it was political, personal, or simply a man's way of saying, "You are mine to destroy." Surviving the physical act of mutilation was only the beginning. For the women who lived through the horror of castration-like punishment in the Middle Ages, the real sentence came after in 780 whispers, in isolation, and in a lifetime of shame. In medieval society, A woman's value was tied almost entirely to her fertility, sexual purity, and obedience. So what happened when those were taken from her? She was no longer seen as a woman. She was seen as a shell, a body stripped of purpose, defiled, and unworthy of love or marriage. These women often became outcasts, shunned by their communities, hidden away in convents, or abandoned by their families. They were blamed for the violence done to them, as if the mutilation proved their guilt rather than their suffering. They were considered ruined, spoiled, touched by sin. Even the church, which claimed to offer mercy, often refused to help. Why? Because a woman who had lost her reproductive function, or worse, had been sexually marked, was believed to be spiritually impure. Many of these women became beggars, forced to live on the fringes of society. Others were locked away in asylums or poorhouses where their mutilation became just another reason to forget them. There was no healing, no justice, no closure, just silence. The psychological trauma was immeasurable. Imagine enduring that pain, then being told you're the one who should be ashamed. No counseling, no medical help. Just a lifetime of whispers and a soul buried in secrecy. Some women went mad. Others took vows as nuns, not out of devotion, but because it was the only place left to hide, and some took their own lives, unable to live in a world that had so violently stolen their identity.